about those military tactics that are being employed by the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza, including airstrikes on hospitals, on schools, even a soccer stadium. How do you respond to the UN High Commissioner's concerns over possible war crimes and the just basic criticism that bombing and shelling hospitals and private homes and even a beach are completely inappropriate in tactics of war?
Well, we don't want to see any civilians caught up in the conflict. We don't want to see a single civilian casualty, not one. Our challenge is that our enemy is ruthless, and our enemy is firing out of schools and hospitals and urban neighborhoods, firing their rockets at our people, trying to kill them. So we're trying to be as pinpointed, as surgical as is humanly possible in a very difficult combat situation, but our intention is not, I repeat, not to hurt Gaza's innocent civilians.
And yet, sir, the death toll is essentially 70% civilian. So does the Israeli government or the IDF specific evidence that, for instance, the Al-Aqsa hospital or the dozens of specific schools, the clinics, even the home of a prominent Palestinian poet, a gentleman named Othman Hussein, do you have specific evidence that those places were harboring weapons or militants?
I think it's best that I let the United Nations speak for itself. The United Nations twice in the last few days has released a report that in UN schools in Gaza, they were storing munitions, they were storing rockets that are fired at our people. In doing so, Hamas is not only obviously putting a school in danger, turning it into a military target, but it's also violating UN neutrality and violating a school where people, young people are supposed to learn. I think that shows us who Hamas is. Hamas ultimately is shielding its terror military machine, the same machine that's shooting all those rockets into Israel. Some 2,000 rockets have been fired at our cities, but they're shielding that machine behind Gaza's civilians. And I think it shows who Hamas is. They have no respect for human life, not Israeli or Palestinian.
But Mr. Regev, with all due respect, the High Commissioner did not say that the Al-Aqsa hospital was harboring militants. She talked generically about the policy, and she also said something else, which is the actions of one party do not absolve the other party of the need to respect its obligations under international law. Surely you're not saying that Israel is under no obligation to operate on a higher level than Hamas, because she very specifically criticized your country, your government, and your military for bombing hospitals and schools and private residences. Can you respond to that specific criticism of the IDF's tactics?
Yes, I can. I agree with the assumption that Hamas are ruthless terrorists and targeting innocent civilians doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to abide by the rules of armed conflict. And we are doing so. We're trying to be as surgical as is humanly possible in a very difficult combat situation. The hospital that we unfortunately had to attack, and we didn't attack a hospital, we attacked a specific command and control center inside a hospital. We asked everyone to leave because we were taking hostile fire from this hospital. And what was interesting, and I urge you to look at the video which is up on the website of the Israeli Defense Forces, you can see our shell goes in and causes a small explosion, and then there are all these secondary explosions, which is clear evidence that Hamas was using the hospital for military purposes. In other words, Hamas had turned that medical facility into a war zone.
You just said that you didn't fire specifically at the hospital. I want to first of all ask you about when you're telling people to leave their homes, where are they expected to go? The entirety of Gaza is being shelled. That's one question. And then if you could also answer the question about the specific policy of Israel to destroy the homes of people who are suspected of nothing more than just being related to armed militants. That is not then a policy that is against Hamas militants, but actually destroying homes of people who are just related to someone suspected of being militants. What do you say to the response that that is collective punishment?
So I'll answer both those questions in detail, if you'll allow me. On the first question, to give the best example I can, we had very serious fighting in the Shadia refugee camp. Not refugee camp, it's a neighborhood of Gaza. And there was difficult house-to-house fighting between our forces and the Hamas terrorists. We lost, unfortunately, quite a few of our young men in that battle. But before going in, we requested, we urged the civilian population to leave the area because we knew it was going to be a battle zone.
But and to go
we
where?
had to go in because there was...
We have very short time, sir, but where are you...
refuge neighborhood.
Where are you asking people to go? There is nowhere safe in Gaza right now. It's densely populated. Where are you expecting people to go?
No. I was about to answer that question. I was precisely going to make that point. So we leafleted the area and we urged people to leave. And actually, and I asked your NBC correspondent on the ground there in Gaza, he can find them. We leafleted the area and we actually drew a map and we said, go to this specific safe area. In other words, it was specifically pointed out to the people there where they could go. And the people who went to that area were unharmed.
And we should also point out,
well,
we have very short time, sir. Please. We have very short time, and I really wanted you to answer my second question
I want to say,
well.
Your viewers have to know something. We urged people to leave a dangerous combat zone. What did Hamas say? Do you know what Hamas said? Hamas urged them to stay. In fact, Hamas put a lot of pressure on people to stay and not to leave the combat area. Do you know why? Because Hamas wants them as human shields. Hamas is interested, unfortunately, in human casualties. They want to see maximum civilian deaths. It's a very sad thing to say, but Hamas is not unlike those other radical, extreme Islamic movements like ISIS in Iraq or Hezbollah in Lebanon or Boko Haram in Nigeria. They really don't give a hoot about the civilian population of Gaza. They're willing to sacrifice them all on the altar of a very reactionary, extremist, fundamentalist agenda.
Sir, you haven't answered my first question, which is where are people supposed to remain? They no longer have a home to go back to. And the second question, and we don't have a great deal of time, the second question is it an ethical policy to bulldoze the home of someone who is merely suspected of being related to someone that you deem to be a terrorist?
So, with respect, I did answer your first question. I said we specifically urged people to go to a safe area that was outlined and detailed where people could go to be safe. And as far as I know, everyone who went to that area was unharmed and wasn't affected by the fighting in that specific area. So that's a specific answer. As to the second question you raised, what we do is we have targeted Hamas command and control. Places where Hamas have set up their operational centers, places where Hamas stores weapons. And we did yesterday for the Secretary General of the United Nations and today for John Kerry, your Secretary of State, we actually did a display to show exactly how it works. You have a civilian house and underneath you have a system of tunnels, of an arsenal of weapons, and Hamas comes out and shoots from that area and goes back underground. And so what you see from up the top is, of course, only a building, a normal building. But what is actually there is you have an integral part of the Hamas war machine. And now we urge people to leave these houses before we attack them, but we have to. If we want to stop the rockets on our people, if we want to protect our people, we have to deal with these targets, and we try to do so with as little as possible, getting civilians caught up in the crossfire.
And we are out of time, but I want to ask one final question, which is that if you're asking people to leave homes that are going to be demolished or bombed, who is then responsible for, right now it's at least 100,000 people who are now homeless. They cannot go back to their homes even after this operation is over. Who is responsible for those people? Israel is the occupying authority. Is Israel now responsible for those essentially homeless and displaced people?
Listen, if you'll allow me, Joy, I want to take issue with one important word you said. You said Israel is the occupying authority. You're forgetting Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip. We took down all the settlements, and the settlers who didn't want to leave, we forced them to leave. We pulled back to the 1967 international frontier. There is no Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip. We haven't been there for some 8 years. Now, why is there hostile rocket fire today from Gaza into Israel? There's not a question of occupation of Gaza. No one claims that Israel is occupying Gaza. The reason for the violence is this Islamic extremism that Hamas represents. You know, when we pulled out of Gaza, everyone supported that. The international community embraced the fact that Israel pulled out of Gaza. Everyone welcomed that. They thought it would give peace a chance, and there was hope that Gaza could become and develop. There was money for investment, for schools, for industry. Gaza was supposed to become this Mediterranean Singapore, and we'd signed an agreement to allow access and trade and commerce and people to go back and forth.
Mr. Regev, I'm sorry.
So
First of all, you're filibustering, and second of all,
Hamas,
sir, I will point out, and we do have to wrap
Hamas
here.
took over.
We need to point out here, sir, that Israel does control the coastline, the airspace, the egress and ingress into Gaza. Gaza is not Singapore. But I do appreciate you coming on,
But
sir.
only, why though? Joy, be fair, why? When we left, we didn't have those restrictions. We only imposed restrictions because of the violence, because of Hamas, because of the rockets. You can't put the cart before the horse. The restrictions were a reaction to violence. Had there been no violence, you would have had open borders. You would have had trade. You would have had cooperation.
We will have to leave it there.